connecting you to the future. The world's library is becoming accessible via the World Wide Web.
Intricate apparatus.
And computer technology has come a long, long way.
Computerized devices.
And using synchrotron beam lines to investigate the nature of incurable diseases. This looks like any other French regional hospital, but it's here that Professor Philippe Arbeel has devised a remote ultrasound scan process which is developing with scientists from the European Space Agency. This is the patient, but he's not with Professor Arbeel. He's several hundred kilometres away with ESA scientist Dr. Bernard Comet. After the application of gel, Dr. Comet places the remote scanner on the patient's stomach. Once contact is made, Professor Arbeel can begin his examination. He activates the probe from his end to start the ultrasound, also known as an echograph. Using a joystick, he's able to remotely control the robotic arm. This is vital where there are few specialists, or where the patient is in a remote location and can't be easily reached. With most health services throughout the world struggling with shrinking budgets and rapidly expanding demand, even a sophisticated system like this becomes cost-effective. From his distant location, Professor Arbeel is able to see for himself exactly what is happening inside his patient. There was the potential to waste so much time travelling between distant locations, making certain that initial diagnoses were accurate.
And most of the time, the patient came to us to have an investigation to say that finally there was no serious disease and they could have been treated at home. So we wondered if we could make this operation, this examination, remotely using either telephone, internet and so on.
The idea for this device arose because doctors were being kept on call for patients referred by small regional hospitals which lacked the expertise to accurately diagnose them. Many of the patients referred didn't have a serious disease and could easily have been treated at home had they had access to the correct consultant. Dr. Comet points out that without Professor Arbeel, he would be unable to offer the patient a diagnosis, despite seeing and touching him. It's precisely this ability to have an accurate view of someone you have no hope of having contact with that attracted the European Space Agency. The project is funded by ESA's Advanced Robotic Teleechography Integrated Service, ARTIS, which aims to create links between sophisticated space technology and parallel ground-based systems. ARTIS project manager Dr. Didier Schmidt says such technology is vital for future space missions.
We need such systems not only currently for the space station program, which will last for at least 10 years from now on, but also for future endeavors like the moon programs that we hope to do with international partners, but even more when we go to the Martian missions later on.
It will take astronauts more than a year to reach Mars, and once the mission has started, there can be no turning back. In a similar way, the ultrasound probe can be used by ships and oil rigs in distant or treacherous waters. The robotic ultrasound system is already being welcomed by some doctors in remote areas, like French Guiana, where local health centres are isolated and unevenly distributed.
You need to do a diagnostic on-site right away. And if you don't have the specialist on-site, you need a teleoperated diagnostic system.
They focused on the ultrasonic examination technique because of its diagnostic value. But it has to be done in real time with a dynamic image. It's essential that the specialist isn't just watching images from the probe. He's actually controlling it via satellite link. So far, most of the images transmitted from remote centres are static due to limitations in bandwidth, but the team is hopeful they'll be able to transmit live pictures and dynamic images. Long-duration missions on the International Space Station will require the use of different medical tools, in order to diagnose crews' health problems. Led by the Institute for Space Physiology and Medicine in Toulouse, the 24-month project aims at validating a complete end-to-end robotised teleechography service. The Institute is confident that a remote robotic technology will have applications across a range of different fields. In the heart of the historic Belgian city of Ghent is the University of Ghent Library. The Art Deco tower contains millions of books that help the students of Belgium's largest university maintain a prominent academic position. Books in French, Flemish, German and English are stored here and will soon be accessible to all. Since 2007, Ghent University has been working with Google to put over 300,000 books into their online collection, freely accessible to anyone in the world with an internet connection. More than 10 million books have already been scanned into Google's electronic index since 2004. Classic works such as Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet can be read online or downloaded. Google has been working with 7 major libraries across Europe, along with scores in the US, to create this vast digital resource. Felipe Colombe from Google says the aim is to be as comprehensive as possible.
We believe that by putting the books in the search results, we make a better Google experience, so we are able to attract more users.
In the US, Google has been scanning books irrespective of age. That provoked a class action lawsuit by publishers and authors, largely resolved after Google agreed to a $125 million US settlement. In Europe, Google is taking a more cautious approach. Under European law, copyright only extends 70 years after an author's death. But Google is only scanning books older than 140 years, so they can expect to ward off potential lawsuits. Librarians go through their indexes and select suitably old material, which they prepare to be sent away for scanning. Some of these originals are extremely rare, so they are handled with great care.
We are scanning out of copyright books, and of course we work with publishers and rights holders for more recent books. But here in Europe, with libraries, our first and foremost effort is to work on the cultural heritage and work with books that and digitized books that are clearly in the public domain.
Making books digitally accessible to everyone will mean that the content of certain very precious, very old books will now be far more widely viewed.
By digitizing this wonderful collection, in fact, that was gathered in the 19th century especially, we make it open to the world and searchable, and now we have an extra library or an extra reading room all over the world, 24 hours a day and 7 days in a week. So it's great.
Publishing is a big industry in Europe, and paper books aren't about to disappear. But as more books go online, some European publishers are unhappy that the US Google agreement means that their books and periodicals have been scanned without permission.
In order to work with someone, you need to have a trust-based relationship. And in order to build that, we think that you have to ask to the publishers or to the authors, if the rights are back to the authors, whether they want their books to be digitized or not. There may be very good reasons for them not to want that the books are digitized by Google, and therefore they should respect that.
Recently, the European Commission held a hearing about Google Books' US settlement with representatives of all the European parties involved. European Commissioner Viviane Reding chaired the meeting.
there are those books which have an author, which have a publisher. But then there are the orphan books, or there are the books which are out of access. What do we do with those? There we need to have very clear legislation and possibility to have those books digitized and to bring them to the public, because today European legislation does not permit to digitize those books. The result, the citizen cannot have access to those books, and this, I believe, that from the cultural point of view is not the right way to proceed.
While the concept of a library accessible around the clock from anywhere with an internet connection has plenty of supporters, opponents cite concerns over how much control Google would be able to exert over pricing and how much information the company intends to collect about the books that people are reading. This may not look like the beginnings of an industry set to assume an important role in the 21st century, but researchers from Australia's James Cook University have identified an algae that soaks up carbon dioxide at a rate that has heavy carbon emitters keen to invest. These microalgae can double their weight every 24 hours.
They take up carbon dioxide from the air, or if you feed them carbon dioxide, they take that, and with the aid of sunlight, they're converting that into sugars, proteins and oils.
The algae can eventually be harvested as a rich feed source for livestock. It contains sugars, proteins and oils, and the oils can also be extracted to create biodiesel and plastics. By looking at the durability, the dietary requirements and the production rate of 180 sample strains of algae, the researchers have identified 5 breeds suited to the task of removing huge amounts of CO2 from industrial emissions, or simply taking it from the atmosphere. Government funding has been made available to establish a pilot algae farm in Townsville. This will be the first of a number of algal farms being planned.
All you have to do is give them appropriate containers in which they can grow and from which you can harvest them. And then it's up to you what you want to do with the biomass. It is highly valuable, or it can be highly valuable. They also produce a lot of antioxidants. They also produce natural sunscreens.
3 of Australia's biggest coal and gas-fired power stations are building algae farms. Each will be set up alongside the plant. The carbon from the exhaust will be injected into wastewater containing the algae. James Cook University has embarked on a research and development collaboration with Melbourne-based company MBD Biodiesel to bring the technology up to industrial levels.
The 3 projects that we've got signed agreements with, we're able to really provide up to half the or reduce half the emissions at each of those sites over the next 5 to 10 years.
Such reductions in carbon emissions have fossil fuel-burning power stations taking notice. Across the world, nations are starting carbon pollution reduction schemes, and effective ways of reducing CO2 output mean huge savings. These microscopic plants could soon have a huge impact. Ten years ago, Australian Melinda Birchick was a successful businesswoman with a demanding schedule. But everything changed when she developed multiple sclerosis, a disease where the body's immune system attacks its own tissues, damaging nerve cells in the brain and spinal cord. The disease has affected Birchick's memory, her ability to move, speak, and even to eat, and she relies on her husband for almost everything. For Melinda, the first sign of the condition was blurred vision, and then her hands began cramping. Her nervous system has continued to deteriorate, and she needs full-time care. At this stage, there is no cure for multiple sclerosis, but work going on at Monash University's Immunology and Stem Cell Laboratories is offering hope to sufferers with diseases like multiple sclerosis. The laboratory has access to the Australian synchrotron, a particle accelerator with a broad range of research applications. With it, medical researchers can probe the chemistry associated with various medical conditions to a minute level not previously possible.
We're trying to shed new light on the disease multiple sclerosis. Specifically, what we're doing is we're using the incredibly bright source of light provided by the Australian synchrotron to probe the chemistry of the disease at very tiny scales.
Around the synchrotron are a series of beam lines where high-speed electrons are used to generate X-rays, microwaves, gamma rays and extremely bright light used to examine matter in detail far beyond the power of conventional microscopes. The synchrotron is the size of a football field, and by accelerating electrons to velocities close to the speed of light, it allows scientists across a number of fields to examine the very nature of matter.
Synchrotrons have allowed us to do things we've never been able to do before. You can take an experiment that is possible in a lab and actually make it happen in a synchrotron thousands of times faster and thousands of times better. What it does is it takes existing know-how, existing ability and existing technology and supercharges it.
Though this is not the world's biggest accelerator, it is the newest and most sophisticated.
Being one of the later beam lines, we've been able to feed on the experience from other synchrotrons, and what that's allowed us to do is get the Rolls-Royce of beam lines, if you like, and we're achieving measurements I haven't seen anywhere else.
To make use of the synchrotron's beam lines, researchers must book time at the facility. Scientists working on precise chemical structures or the shapes of complex molecules, as well as those wishing to obtain detailed images of biological substructures, are queuing up for beam time. New research projects wanting to use a beamline must submit a proposal that will be peer-reviewed before time can be allocated. There are 43 synchrotrons around the world, and their development has been as big a breakthrough for the study of matter as the invention of the microscope. The Monash Group are using infrared technology to study the chemical makeup of multiple sclerosis. They also have plans to examine Huntington's disease and cystic fibrosis, other conditions that have yet to be probed at the structural level.
At the moment, there's no known cures for any of those, and they haven't been probed at this chemistry level. And so we're taking the same sorts of approaches, but of course the diseases are completely different. So each one has its own particular problems.
The Monash team is trying to understand the autoimmune process believed to trigger MS. The research also has implications for patients suffering from other autoimmune diseases, such as insulin-dependent diabetes, and for those with spinal cord injury. In Australia, there are 16,000 people with MS. So far, there are still no solutions for sufferers like Melinda Birchick. But new knowledge about the disease means the possibility of a breakthrough is one step closer. The computer we take for granted has a complex history. It was not until the 1940s that computers functioning along lines we could recognise today emerged as code-breaking machines used during the Second World War. These early units were huge, required huge amounts of electricity, and had only laughably small amounts of computing power. By the 1960s, computers were solid state, with thousands of transistors replacing thermionic valves. They found places in industry and universities. In 1969, two computers exchanged test data via a 5-metre cable. That became the Internet. The mass-produced silicon chip was the breakthrough of the 1970s. It was fast, it was powerful, and it was cheap. Via the chip, computer technology found its way into domestic appliances like the television receiver. Integrated circuits were becoming common. In 1981, IBM launched its first personal computer with just 16K of memory. The collection at the UK's Computer Museum in Swindon features 3,000 exhibits, ranging from an abacus to microchips. For the British, the ZX Spectrum was the first home computer to catch on in a big way. Its major rival was the Commodore 64. The growing use of home computers led to a boom in software development. But some models still deserve legendary status.
This is the Next Cube, a sort of high-end workstation from 1990. It's a fantastic looking machine. It's if the Borg had a computer, I guess it'd look like this. It's a pretty rare beast. We're very lucky to have one of these, and in especially such good condition. It's a fairly significant machine, and that on one of these machines, Tim Berners-Lee developed the World Wide Web, which is something we're all sort of very familiar with now.
The modern computer has borrowed from many different types of precursor technology, and the Computing Museum has attempted to feature examples that contributed to the most modern machine. The NEC Ultralight, the first notebook-style laptop launched in 1989, sits near a slide rule, a device used by early rocket engineers at NASA. Chip technology opened up new systems like the Mondex card, the first smart card to include its own chip. It was a stored value card, and users could use a small reader to monitor its balance. The museum has a large collection of computer games. They even have publicity clips that include the first TV tennis games console. The games collection stretches back to the first TV tennis games console. Other famous games in the collection include Sonic the Hedgehog, which sold 50 million copies, as well as Pac-Man and Tetris. But the museum also includes current games like rally driving simulators that contain the very latest in chip and graphics technology.
Yeah, games is a huge there's an enormous amount of interest in the history of gaming, and we go back to 1972 when the first TV tennis games console came out, the Magnavox Odyssey, and we go right through to the sort of present day. So our last exhibition was called Pong to PlayStation, which charted the history of the home games console.
Released by Sega in 1991, Sonic the Hedgehog was intended to become the company's mascot to rival Nintendo's Mario. It triggered spin-offs in books, comics and cartoons. Launched in 1989, the Game Boy was Nintendo's first handheld device to use video games cartridges. The company has sold almost 120 million devices.
The interest is that a lot of the youngsters nowadays have no real idea how primitive things were a few years ago. They've been brought up with the internet. They can't imagine an age which doesn't have the internet in there. And the idea is to show some of the early computer games and just how basic they were and how well the programmers did with the very limited capacity.
Gordon Graylish works for chipmaker Intel. It's the largest manufacturer of microprocessors in the world, and Graylish has been with the company since 1982. He's seen a lot of changes in the computing business.
This was the first one that I could say was my computer. It's an Osborne, and you would actually bring it home. You'd have to plug it in because there was no battery, and you would work forever to get very little out of it. But it was the first example of a mobile computer, and I think to show how far we've gone, it also cost £1,795. So, I mean, we've come down in price a bit since then, too.
The computer and the internet have developed rapidly, and they continue to advance. It's difficult to imagine a world without computers, and it's difficult to imagine where the technology is heading. But by seeing how far digital machines have progressed, we can get an idea how quickly things will change.